Hey, hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. And long time no see. Sorry about that. Things were... You can't see me, but know that I'm gesturing vaguely towards, everything. But we're back, and once again returning to the Dollenganger literary universe with Beneath the Attic by V.C. Andrews, the first book in a trilogy of spin-off novels following Karin Dixon, Malcolm's mother and the great-grandmother of the Dollenganger children, whom their mother, Karin, was named after. So, spoilers for the aforementioned Beneath the Attic by V.C. Andrews, as well as for the Dollenganger series as a whole, because I'm going to be referencing events from that throughout this. But specifically from Garden of Shadows, because that's where most of our information about Karin comes from. Also, content warning for essay, misogyny, and referenced child abuse. Alright folks, back to the Dollenganger saga we go. First, and as mostly always, the technical stuff. And let me preference the technical stuff by saying this. I did very much like this book. In fact, to be kind of blunt about it, of the V.C. Andrews books I've read that have been solely authored by Andrew Niederman, her ghostwriter, this and the second book, Out of the Attic, are the best written ones in my opinion. Pacing is pretty solid. It drags a bit here and there, but honestly it's nothing to write home about and gets back on track fairly quickly. The main characters, for the most part, are solid enough. There's not much to the side characters, but again, there's enough there that they do what they need to. The prose is okay. I think it's way better than in the Christopher trilogy. Please imagine the air quotes. I said what I said. And I said this before when I talked about Secret Brother, but it bears repeating here. I think Andrew Niederman's writing style and the way that he writes his characters, especially his teenage characters, his teenage girl characters specifically, work better in a pre-1980s setting. In this case, the 1890s. For your reference, this book takes place in 1890. Put a pin in that because I'm going to make that way deeper than it needs to be. Like I said, I genuinely enjoyed this book. I think there's a lot that it does well, especially in the second half. That being said, this did not need to be a full-length novel in my opinion. My edition of Beneath the Attic, which you should see on screen somewhere with me now, is almost 400 pages long, and to be blunt about it, not a lot really happens. There's a lot of interesting setup for things that I know we're never going to get any resolution for. That sounds kind of mean, but it happened in the last spin-off trilogy, so I'm not holding my breath. I don't know, maybe it'll turn out I'm wrong, since at the time of filming, I haven't started the third and final book. I really do hope that I'm wrong, because like I said, there's a lot of really interesting and really cool setup. But I doubt it. So that's the technical stuff. Let's talk about Beneath the Attic. So Beneath the Attic begins in 1890 with 16-year-old Karin Dixon having a hot girl summer. R.I.P. Karin, you would have loved Brat Summer. Technically, the prologue takes place when she's 12, but we'll get to that. And Karin is really out here living her best life. She's popular, has lots of friends. Please imagine the air quotes, but we'll get to that. All the boys in town are practically falling over themselves to court her. She has all the latest gadgets, including a cherry red bicycle, because it's 1890. She also comes from money. Her family isn't wildly wealthy, but they're those rich people who would probably describe themselves as comfortable. And Karin and her parents are very comfortable. But to back up a bit to the original Dollenganger series, we're first introduced to Karin in the third book, If There Be Thorns, and we're introduced to her through her son Malcolm Foxworth's journal. I'm going to talk more about the minefield that is their relationship when we get to Out of the Attic, but I want you to keep in mind as we move forward that until this trilogy, specifically the first two books, which are in Karin's point of view, everything that we know about her comes from Malcolm, either from his journal in the aforementioned If There Be Thorns, or from him directly in Garden of Shadows. So what do we know about Karin according to her son? Honestly, not a hell of a lot, and what we do know about her isn't great. So in Malcolm's journal, we learn that Karin left him and his father for another man when Malcolm was 5 years old, and that once she was gone, Malcolm was abused by his father, Garland. And Garland's favorite punishment was to beat Malcolm bloody with a switch and then lock him, sometimes for hours, in the attic with no food. The same way his wife Olivia and his daughter Karin would do to her children. I can't remember which of you said it in the comments, but I want you to know that I think about it often. That poison just drips on down. In Garden of Shadows, which is the prologue to the Dollenganger saga, we hear this story again directly from Malcolm. We also learn that Karin's room, the Swan Room, has essentially been frozen in time. It looks exactly like it did when she left, almost like it's just waiting for her to come back. According to Malcolm, Karin was very beautiful, very spoiled, materialistic, and selfish. Like I said, we're going to talk about the minefield that is their relationship when we talk about Out of the Attic in the near-ish future, but as we move forward, it's important for your reference to know that Malcolm loves his mother an obsessive and incestuous degree. Yet he also despises her for leaving him with his father. For your reference, this passage that I'm about to read to you comes from Garden of Shadows. This is when Malcolm finally tells his wife, Olivia, about his mother. She did what she wanted, when she wanted, as she wanted. Nothing mattered when it came to her own pleasures. My God, Olivia, you know the type, he said as his hands rested on my shoulders. They're exactly what you are not. Flimsy, narcissistic, flighty women. They flirt. They have no loyalty to any man, and they can't be trusted with anything, he added. That's who Karin is, according to Malcolm. Vapid, spoiled, selfish, materialistic person who ran off and left her son at the hands of his abusive father, never to be seen again. But that's Malcolm's version of who she was. And I've talked about it before, but I don't think he's an especially reliable narrator. My polite way of saying that if that man is talking, I think he's lying. Same with Garland while we're on the subject. Being said, although it bothers me on a spiritual level to admit that Malcolm is telling the truth, the Karin that we first meet in Beneath the Attic is pretty close to the picture Malcolm painted of her, because by her own admission, she is very spoiled, very vain, very materialistic, and selfish. And to be blunt about it, she's kind of mean. Now, when I talked about Clara from Secret Brother, I made the comment, is this character actually unlikable, or are they just a teenage girl? Well, in Karin's case, two things can be true at once because she's kind of awful, and I love her for it. I like an unlikable character. What can I say? Karin is our point of view character for these first two novels, so our time is spent in her head, and in Beneath the Attic we spend pages upon pages hearing about how she's prettier than everyone, her friends, her peers, her mother's friends, random women on the street, how she's smarter, richer, and just better than every other woman in existence. Followed in and often sought compliments more like someone who was far more insecure about her appearance than someone who was confident in her beauty. I even requested praise from mirrors hanging everywhere I went, often pausing to ask, am I truly lovely? And always I heard the answer I expected, the answer I deserved. Karin is also the richest of her friends, which she has no problem reminding them and us constantly. And while her family doesn't have Foxworth level money, they are very wealthy, like I said. And that brings us to Karin's family. So Karin Dixon is the only daughter of a successful banker, Harrington Dixon, and his wife, Rosemary, who are, in my opinion, deeply unhappy and very dysfunctional people, but they're rich, so they have that going for them. Harrington, at least on the surface, put a pin in that, seems to be a pretty easygoing, relatively chill guy, but he's also very much trying to keep up with the Joneses. Even though he's already very well off, he still wants more, and more. He works constantly and spends very little time at home, and instead tries to make up for that lack of time with stuff. Expensive stuff. Clothes, jewelry, shopping sprees, and all that jazz. He dotes on Karin and spoils her. He also hates his wife. Like, he hates this woman. Don't get it twisted. He's not cruel to her, but Harrington is also incredibly dismissive of Rosemary. He's horribly condescending, makes major decisions without talking to her. Toward the end of the book, he literally starts building a new house without even discussing it with her, which is crazy work, in my opinion. He also undermines her constantly, especially when it comes to Karin. He lets her be the strict parent and then swoops in to play the fun one. He sucks and has bad vibes. More on that later. And that brings us to Rosemary. Rosemary is what my mom would call old-fashioned because she is significantly politer than I am. She's very set in her ways and the world is changing around her. Beneath the Attic takes place in the 1890s. This was the Gilded Age, and it was a huge transitional period where the world was very rapidly changing. Cities were growing, technology was advancing, and there was a shift away from Victorian morality. The world, like I said, is changing, and Rosemary is very much stuck in the past and struggling with that. The book only touches on this a bit, but every so often I like to use my very expensive history degree for something, so here you go. Rosemary was married very young, and the implication is that her marriage to Harrington was basically arranged by her parents. And Karin's biggest fear is that her mother will do the same for her someday. Reference, the passage I'm about to read comes from much later in the book, when Karin has to get a summer job that her parents basically pick out for her and tell her that she's going to do. They would arrange my future after all. My mind raked through the images and memories of young men my father thought were up-and-coming businessmen, sons of well-to-do ones as well. If boring was a color, they'd be dressed in that. This is one of Karin's biggest fears, that her life is going to be decided for her, that she won't get a choice, and she won't get to live the life that she wants. Fortunately, put a pin in that. Like I said, I think Rosemary and Harrington are deeply unhappy. Harrington constantly disrespects and dismisses her, and so does Karin. Put a pin in that as well. And I think Rosemary is, in many ways, very resentful of her daughter, and so she is very controlling. I do think some of this comes from anxiety, because Karin is getting older, and thus she's losing the control she has over her, as the world is very rapidly changing around her. And some of it does come from a genuine place of concern, but that does not excuse the way that she treats her daughter. Rosemary is incredibly controlling when it comes to Karin. She tries to control what she wears, who she's friends with, and where she goes. Like I said, I do think some of this does come from a genuine place of concern, but that doesn't excuse the way that she treats her daughter, and she's often very, very cruel to Karin. I think she wants to hold so tightly to the control she has of her daughter because Karin is kind of the one thing that Rosemary actually has any control over. Like I said, her husband literally starts building a new house without talking to her. I say all that to say, while I think Rosemary loves Karin and vice versa, their relationship is not healthy. But given that this is the Dollenganger saga, that's a bit like saying fork found in kitchen. Back to the present. And so Karin is having her hot girl summer. She's going on bike rides and taking picnics and hanging out with her friends Daisy, Edna, and Agnes. Despite Karin stating throughout the book that Daisy is her best friend, none of these girls play a huge role in anything that happens and seem to exist solely for Karin to mock, both out loud and in her head, jealous of her good looks and her popularity of the boys. The girls often meet up away from the prying eyes of their parents to attend what Karin calls her womanly talks. Capital letters. What are her womanly talks? Honestly, they see about a bit of everything, but mostly the very taboo subjects of sex and romance, of which Karin considers herself an expert, thanks to a combination of what she learned from a young nurse named Grace Rose, who we'll talk about in a second, and various books that she's read. R.I.P. Karin, you would have loved AO3. And Karin is very much in a hurry to grow up. The book opens with her at 12 getting her first period, and Rosemary literally cannot handle the fact that Karin is growing up. So much so that she can't even talk to her daughter about what's happening, and instead literally hires a nurse named Grace Rose to come and talk to her. Yeah. And again, I think this at least partially goes back to the transition from the Victorian era to the Gilded Age. Not entirely, but partially, because Rosemary is very much stuck in that previous era where women were expected to marry and submit to their husbands, care for the home and the kids. And don't get it twisted, the Gilded Age wasn't much better, though people were starting to push against these very rigid roles. But there was still very much this emphasis on piety, purity, and submissiveness. But I digress. Like I said, I have a very expensive history degree, and sometimes I like to use it for things. All relevant articles linked down below. And Karin immediately locks in. She is a woman now, and she's ready to start her adult life because she's 12 and has no idea what that actually entails. Once I was free, I would bask in the looks of admiration and welcome the wave after wave of compliments unchecked. Men would strain their limits of their imaginations to outdo each other with flowery praise simply to win my smile. Those who were granted a touch of my hand would struggle to keep themselves from exploding with desire. My beauty was that powerful. Honestly, I saw so much of Kathy in Karin, especially in these earlier chapters. Karin is very much a romantic. She's eager to get out there and have relationships. She wants to be an adult. She wants to be a grown-up. And while she's more physically mature than her friends and very, very well informed about sex and relationships, thanks to Grace Rose, who was very open and honest with Karin about these things and gave her the facts. Karin, like I said, very much considers herself to be an expert in these things. Put a very unfortunate pin in that. And she's very ready to leave childhood behind and to strike out on her own and live her own life. And while Karin is technically very well informed, considers herself to be an adult, she's 16 years old. She's a kid. And she very much has a kid's idea of what it means to be an adult. She doesn't really know. Not yet. Nobody does. His journey to Foxworth Hall begins with a gala, specifically the Wexler Gala, which is an anniversary party hosted by Simon Wexler, who is the chairman of the board of trustees at the bank where Harrington works. And rumor has it that the position of bank president is going to be opening up soon, and making a good impression at the gala could help put Harrington over the top in consideration. So he's decided, without discussing this with Rosemary, because why would he, that the Wexler Gala is the perfect time for Karin's coming out. This is when a young woman is formally presented to society, which marks her as being eligible for marriage. And again, Karin immediately locks in, much to Rosemary's chagrin, because Harrington just announces this at breakfast this morning and doesn't discuss it with her. Why would he? Again, he hates his wife, like I said. So this is a long-ish passage, but in my opinion, it really gives you a clear idea of who Karin is at this point in the story. Would be making a grand entrance at a gala attended by the rich and powerful, their wives wearing the latest fashion. I would finally step onto the stage as a young woman and not a child tagging along behind her parents. For the past year or so, I had been rehearsing for this dramatic entrance into the Alexandria, Virginia's social world, practicing my walk, my posture, and shaping my smile. My mother's busybody friends would surely fan their heated faces harder once they saw me grown and developed. My sexuality revealed, I thought. Men would turn their heads quickly as I passed. Some would suffer neck strain. The daughters of other people, especially my parents' friends, would gasp so hard with envy that they might pee in their knickers. Closest friends certainly would. Daisy's eyes would shed green tears, even though we were best friends. Because Harrington has decided they're going to the gala and Karin is going to be coming out, that's what's happening, which means it's time to go shopping. Here's where I want to circle back to Harrington and Karin's relationship. At this point in our story, as strained as the relationship is between Rosemary and Karin, Karin is actually incredibly close to her father. She feels he understands her in a way that Rosemary just doesn't. That he's more easygoing. Again, this is because he just swoops in and gets to be the fun parent, while Rosemary is the strict one, with him often undermining her, usually right in front of Karin. By her own words, Harrington dotes on her and spoils her, and often it's the two of them against Rosemary. They're the fun ones, the outgoing ones, the popular ones. Rosemary is overly pious and boring and dull. Karin isn't like her. She's like Harrington. So the family gets ready for the gala, with Karin getting a gown that's more in line with adult fashion than being a child's gown like she's worn before, much to Rosemary's annoyance. And so it's the night of the gala at the fabulous Wexler house, which is filled with the who's who of Virginia high society. We're in Virginia, by the way, I don't know if I said that. And a new arrival from one of the wealthiest families in the entire state has come all the way from Charlottesville to be a potential investor in the bank. Garland, Foxworth. Karin, being very charming and very beautiful, is very much a hit at the party, much to her mother's annoyance and the jealousy of her friends. And she immediately takes notice of Garland because he's young, well-dressed, and extremely handsome. And he immediately takes notice of her. Way across the ballroom, I heard a man ask, "Where have you been all my life?" I paused and looked to my right. It was the man who had been staring at me. "Excuse me, were you addressing me, sir?" A laughing smile reappeared, which seemed to light up his deep blue eyes. "Addressing? Yes, I think so," he said. There was delicious danger in the way he looked at me, so clearly undressing me with his eyes and his imagination that it rushed up from my neck through my face. Garland is seemingly everything Karin has been dreaming of. He's older. He's 23. And just a reminder that Karin is 16, and later Garland started grooming his second wife when she was 12, so he's always been a creep. But to Karin, he's handsome and charming and very, very rich. And Karin is immediately taken with him, and Garland knows all the right things to say and to do. Please call me Garland, even when you're vexed at me. I don't know you well enough to be vexed at you, sir, but I can see where if I did, I might be. And often, I said, my eyes on fire. He looked like I'd just confirmed that I was the goddess he had been searching for all his life. I pin in that because I'm going to make that a whole thing later. The two of them spend most of the gala together, even sharing a dance, Karin's first ever waltz, which Garland teaches her, and we learn a little bit more about his family. He had a younger, unnamed sister who died during childbirth, and then her husband and child moved overseas to Europe after her death. He doesn't see them very often and doesn't really seem to care to. He travels extensively and has recently taken up his father's hobby of big game hunting. Both his parents are dead and died when he was young, leaving him with the family fortune and, of course, the family home, Foxworth Hall. Before the night is over, Karin and Garland are able to sneak away to take a walk alone in the gardens without a chaperone. Absolutely scandalous behavior. And Garland, as it turns out, is not in town for long and is returning to Charlottesville basically right after the gala. But Karin is quick to tell him about her great aunt, who just so happens to live in Charlottesville, that she just so happened to might be visiting soon. And maybe if she does, he could call on her. And he gives her his card so that she can write him if she's ever in town and he can show her Foxworth Hall. Karin has not visited this great aunt since she was a very small child, nor has she ever traveled alone before because, again, she is 16. But she has decided that Garland is what she wants, and what Karin wants, Karin gets. And things definitely don't seem to be one-sided. Key word there being seem, as Garland seems to be very, very interested in her. So much so that he kisses her. Again, this is a long-ish passage, but I think it really gives you an idea of where we are with Karin and her thoughts on things at this stage in the story. I made my decision months, maybe years ago. There was no exploration more exciting than my own sexuality. Yes, I wanted boyfriends, but I wanted them to be grown men, and here with his hands on my shoulders and his lips on mine was my first real man, perhaps the first of many. Maybe it was evil for me to think that, but I believed that a woman could have more than one sexual partner too. I was no Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There was nothing more boring to me as politics and this whole debate about a woman's right to vote. No, the equality I sought was in the bedroom. I kissed him back as strongly and as passionately as he was kissing me. That the gala comes to an end with Karin and Garland parting ways, Irma returning to her parents, who have very different reactions to her debut into Virginian high society. Rosemary is very, very not happy, as you can imagine. She thinks Karin is too young, that things are moving too fast, and again, don't get me wrong, some of this does come from a place of concern, and in my opinion, some of it does also come from anger that Karin is slipping out from under her control. Because she's, again, really the only thing Rosemary has any control over, and she doesn't want to lose that. Harrington, by contrast, is delighted, but I don't think it's because he's happy things went well for his daughter. Not entirely, because, again, I do think he loves Karin. But Garland is also a very wealthy, very important potential investor in the bank, which could basically guarantee his spot as bank president if he was interested in Karin. It's probably why he's immediately on board when Karin says she wants to visit her great aunt in Charlottesville, something she has never ever expressed before. And Rosemary wasn't born yesterday. She knows that whatever reason Karin has for wanting to go to Charlottesville, it ain't to visit an aunt that she barely knows. But again, what Karin wants, Karin gets. So she writes her great aunt Nettie and asks if she can come visit. And she also writes Garland to tell him that he should call on her if she's able to visit Charlottesville. While Karin waits for a response, she's the envy of her friend group, as two of the girls were at the party and not only saw her waltz, but also saw the two of them go into the garden together alone. And Karin is absolutely living for this. And meanwhile, Rosemary is trying to convince her not to go, partially because she knows something is up, but also because her great aunt Nettie isn't well and hasn't been for years. So for your reference moving forward, even though Nettie doesn't play as big a role in this story as I was expecting, but we'll get to that, it's worth noting for your reference that she is a former school teacher whose husband made a fortune in shipbuilding. However, her life has also been marred by tragedy. Both her sons died very young fighting in the Civil War, and her husband died not long after. She never remarried, and all her immediate family is gone, and it's been years since anyone in her extended family have visited her. She lives in a crumbling mansion and is cared for by an English woman named Hazel, who it's implied that her husband bought for her. Yeah, and she's cared for by Hazel because her memory has very much deteriorated over the years. But Karin won't hear any of it. She's lost in the fantasy that she's been building literally her entire life. And when Hazel, for Nettie, writes her and invites her to come stay with them, also gets a response from Garland saying for her to write him when she gets to Charlottesville, Karin absolutely jumps at the chance to go. And so off to Charlottesville she goes, traveling alone for the first time in her life. The driver who meets her at the train station brings her to Nettie's house. She's shocked at the state of the place. Picture like a less extreme Grey Gardens situation. And Great Aunt Nettie herself has absolutely no idea who she is. Despite Rosemary's warnings, Karin had no idea things had deteriorated this badly, and she's really hoping Garland comes to call on her soon because she does not want to stay here any longer than she has to. Again, the house is filthy. Hazel herself is quite elderly and can't really keep up with the chores in the massive house anymore. And it's basically falling down and rotting around these two women. Despite Nettie's condition and the state of the house, both of them, but Hazel especially, are happy to see Karin. Even that Nettie was once a very prominent lady in Charlottesville high society for many years, Karin decides to tell them about the handsome young man whose acquaintance she recently made and asks about the Foxworths. And here's why I thought Nettie would have a bigger role in this story, because she might not remember much, but as clear as day, she remembers that she doesn't like the Foxworths and that they're not good people. My husband didn't like Neil Foxworth, she said. She didn't look like she was talking to me especially. It was more like someone reciting as she remembered. He said he'd sell his mother for a silver dollar. Made me wonder what exactly he had heard about the Foxworth and what exactly their reputation is in town. What do you know, Nettie? What do you know? Why can't you remember your own name, but you remember you hate these people? Why? We never get an answer. Honestly, Karin doesn't have to wait long. The same day that she arrives at the house, Garland comes to call. Literally that night. Can you hear the alarm bells ringing? Can you see the red flags flying? Well, you will shortly. Garland's story is that he just returned home from a business trip and just had to pass by the house, so he decided to drop by. I don't buy this, and neither does Nettie, but Garland immediately turns on the charm, and Hazel invites him in for cake while she takes Nettie upstairs to bed. Garland and Karin chat a bit before he invites her to visit Foxworth Hall. Tonight. Right now. And I think he does this specifically when Hazel and Nettie are out of the room. He realized that they're alone in the house and they're two much older people, one of whom needs a great deal of care. So he can get Karin to come home with him without anyone being the wiser or even coming looking for her. His eyes took on a new intensity, his face almost vibrating with delight and exhilaration. He looked at the doorway and then toward the kitchen like someone afraid to be overheard. For a moment, he tapped his derby against his leg as he pondered. I don't know why, but my anticipation of what he would say next kept me from taking a breath. I imagine, then, that they wouldn't notice if you were gone now, he said. Gone now? You mean go to Foxworth Hall now? Yeah, that's exactly what he means. And it's here I want to talk about Garland Foxworth himself. So, like Karin, what we learn about Garland comes from their son and my enemy, Malcolm. And like with Karin, what we know about him from Malcolm is not great. In his journal, Malcolm talks about Garland abusing him and locking him in the attic after Karin abandoned the family before basically shipping him off to boarding school so he didn't have to deal with him. But then when we meet Garland and his second wife, Alicia, who is 19 years old when we meet her, whom he started grooming when she was 12. Yes, I'm going to keep harping on that. As I should, honestly. The Garland that we meet in Garden of Shadows is very different from the version of him we and Bart read about in Malcolm's journal, and even what he's told Olivia about his father, what little he did tell her. The Garland we meet as he appears in Garden of Shadows, apart from the fact that he should be on to catch a predator, is a fun, generous, and good-natured, personable, charming, and just all-around chill guy. And Malcolm hates him. Actively despises him. He blames Garland for Karin leaving and for shipping him off to boarding school so he wouldn't have to raise him. He hates Garland so much that he never wrote to tell him that he was married or had children. And we know from Bart reading Malcolm's journal in If There Be Thorns that Garland was physically abusive to Malcolm. Like I said, a common punishment, imagine the air quotes, of his was to beat Malcolm and then lock him in the attic, sometimes for hours at a time. And while Malcolm never confronts Garland about this or even brings it up in Garden of Shadows, I fully believe what Malcolm wrote in his journal about Garland, because I think the two of them are more alike than Malcolm would ever admit. They're both incredibly manipulative. The way that Garland charms and love bombs Karin is not unlike the way that Malcolm would later do to Olivia, when he claims that he's in love with her. They can both be very, very charming when they want something, and cold and cruel when things do not go their way. And they feel that things should always go their way, that they're entitled to have things go their way. Again, that poison just drips on down. Although she's hesitant and maybe a little scared, maybe more so than she would ever admit, because she's just a kid, Karin ends up sneaking out with Garland to visit Foxworth Hall, which is just as grand and beautiful as he promised, even in the dark. And we also learn from him that the house has 36 rooms, a lobby, and a ballroom, which is wild, but apart from Garland and a skeleton staff, this is empty. Despite how grand and beautiful it is, Karin can't shake the feeling that there's something sinister about the place. As I set eyes on Foxworth Hall rising against the night sky as we drew closer, I understood Garland's arrogance. His home sat above and looked down on the far smaller houses splattered up almost randomly beneath it. For a part of the day, Foxworth Hall literally blocked the sun and cast long, seemingly ever-creeping deep shadows over so many of these homes and their residents. Even my father would be intimidated as he approached and then entered this mansion. How powerful and rich must the man be who owns all this, he would surely think. I know I did. That feeling only intensifies once she's actually inside the house, this sense that she's unwelcome and unwanted there. And to say Garland is intense about the house is an understatement. And it's not just that the house is beautiful and historic and he's proud of it, it's more than that. Garland talks about Foxworth Hall like it's a living thing whose spell he's under. And he's so intense about it that Karin kind of starts to feel weird about it. He was still holding my hand, his look more intense. You are even more beautiful here, Karin, but that's another proof of Foxworth magic. Diamonds twinkle brighter within its grasp. I can feel it, he said, gazing around. This house likes you. You glitter in its light. I can only imagine what it would be like to have you here all the time. You'd fall so in love with it, I'd be jealous. All the time, I thought, jealous? My body wasn't craving it. I might not have taken a breath. Oh, it goes without saying the most important setting in the entire Dollenganger series is the attic. The attic is the catalyst for everything that happens in the series. The Dollenganger children's imprisonment there is what changes them and the course of not only their lives, but the lives of their children forever until they're finally able to break the cycle that their family has been stuck in for generations. A close second is probably Foxworth Hall itself. The third, in my opinion, is the Swan Room, but we'll talk more about that when we talk about Out of the Attic. So for now, back to Foxworth Hall. Now, I talked about this when we talked about Seeds of Yesterday, the final book in the original series, but it very much bears repeating here, because both this book and its sequel just adds credence to my theory that the house is evil. That's a joke, but not as much as you'd think. So, houses play a massive role in Gothic literature. especially in gothic horror, which the Doppelganger series very much is. The spin-off novels are less so, in my opinion, but some of the elements are still there. And I'm not saying Foxworth Hall is haunted in a literal sense. The ghosts are more of the metaphorical variety. We have characters throughout the many years that the Doppelganger series spans, talking about how it feels suffocating there, and that there's this sense of something very heavy and very wrong that hangs over everything. There's also this sense that once it has its claws into you, it's never going to let you go. It's a beautiful house, yet there's something deeply sinister about it, and Karin feels that from the moment she gets there. Garland gives Karin the 10-cent tour of the house, and as I said, despite the bad vibes, the house is everything that he promised and more. Garland also brings Karin to his bedroom and the swan room, which is the most beautiful room in the house and that Karin has ever seen, and she immediately feels a connection to the room, and feels safe in there, feels welcome in there in a way that she doesn't in Foxworth Hall. Like I said, we're going to talk more about the swan room later, because it's basically a character of its own in Out of the Attic, but it's worth noting that Garland says the room was built for his mother by his father, who didn't like the room at all. And it seems like Garland doesn't like the room either, because he's quick to move Karin to another empty bedroom, where he's got this special drink for them. The recipe that he brought back all the way from Europe. It's called limoncello, according to Google. I don't drink, so I don't know. And it's a lemon liqueur from Italy with a very high alcohol content. And he keeps serving it to Karin, I think fully with the intention of getting her drunk. And I think this was the plan all along, given that none of the staff that they come across seem especially shocked that he has shown up with this young woman in the middle of the night, and the fact that the drink was already waiting for them in the bedroom. Like I said, I think this was Garland's plan all along. And apart from a few glasses of champagne that she's had here and there, all from her parents, and the one she shared with Garland at the gala, Karin hasn't really drank before. And because the limoncello is very sweet and Garland keeps insisting that she keeps drinking, Karin soon gets very drunk. And it's then that Garland makes his move. And again, I fully believe this was his intention all along, to get Karin drunk and take advantage of her, which he sadly does. And Karin does not want this to happen. Let me be very clear about that. She does not want this. Despite Garland telling her that she does, she doesn't. And he assaults her. And afterwards, she's very clearly distraught and wants to leave, and for a few terrifying pages, it really seems like Garland fully intends on keeping her there, and even tries to get her to drink even more, all the while insinuating that she not only wanted what happened, but that she is glad that it did. Because he's a creep, and I hate him. He took a long sip of his glass of limoncello, and then he looked at me and smiled. "This never disappoints," he said, holding up the glass, "and you liked it too." Liked it too? Right now, I felt I had been hypnotized and drugged with a sweet-tasting arsenic. I was on the verge of crying, bawling uncontrollably. I think he saw my lips tremble and moved quickly to lie beside me again. Now, Karin, don't blame yourself for making things more difficult for us tonight. I hate him. They should hit him with a bus." All of it had to be overcome eventually. It's all a part of growing into a woman. My own mother told me that. Not that I was old enough at the time to understand it. Jail, just immediately jail. Karin and us are rightfully horrified and disgusted by that because, and excuse the language, fucking yikes. Thankfully, Karin throws up everywhere and demands Garland leave her alone to clean up, something he does very reluctantly. And once Karin cleans herself up a bit in one of the bathrooms, she then demands to go home, devastated by what happened and the fact that Garland really doesn't give a shit that she's shaky and sick and clearly upset. He does not care about her. I don't think he ever did, to be blunt about it. I think he saw a pretty young girl he could take advantage of, something that seems to be a hobby of his, and once he got what he wanted, he fully intends on discarding her, as you'll see shortly. Lucas, Garland's driver, takes Karin back to Nettie and Hazel's house, and he's the one, not Garland, who finally asks if she's okay and actually seems to be really uncomfortable, but also not unaccustomed to this whole thing. Karin sneaks back into the house without waking anyone and essentially passes out until Hazel, who thinks she's just tired from her travels, looking for her at about noon and finally wakes her up. And Karin is hungover and trying to process everything that happened the night before. She has lunch with Hazel and Nettie, who often confuses Karin with her long-dead sister, but like I said, they're both really kind to her and genuinely seem happy she's there. And then there's a knock at the door, and Karin hopes that it's Garland come to call on her, to apologize, and that they can start over. That this can still be the fairy tale romance she's hoping for. But it's not Garland at the door. Instead, it's Lucas with a message from him, and it's just as crappy as Garland is. Karin, I'm so sorry, but pressing business has called me away. Perhaps in the near future you will return to Charlottesville, and I can show you Foxworth Hall in all its daytime splendor. Until then, yours very sincerely, Garland Foxworth. Got what he wanted, and now he's throwing Karin away. Is shattered by the assault and now the rejection, and she's barely holding it together, so she decides that she needs to get out of there. She needs to go home. She goes to town with Hazel under the guise of wanting to go shopping, and actually sends her father a telegram telling him that she's coming home early, and then buys a train ticket for later that afternoon. Hazel is heartbroken by this because I think she genuinely enjoyed having Karin there, but Karin is practically crawling out of her skin and needs to get as far away from this place as possible. On the train ride home, still trying to process her feelings about what happened, the shame at what Garland did to her, the violation, the guilt, and the shame, and the blame that she's feeling. And while Karin is absolutely not at fault in any shape or form, let me be very crystal clear about that, she still feels a lot of guilt and shame about what happened to her. She also has no idea what to tell her parents because she doesn't want them to know what happened. She doesn't want anyone to know what happened. And as soon as she gets off the train, Harrington can see that something is wrong. "Turned you around so soon?" he asked. "I quickly decided to blame it all on the house and Great Aunt Nettie's condition. Hazel had to keep reminding her who I was. The guest room was disgusting. There were spiders in the dresser drawers. I didn't take any of my clothes out of my bag. They have no hot water most of the time. The ceiling in my room looked like it might fall on me." Harrington isn't buying it, and straight up asks if the reason she's back has to do with Garland. So the version of the story Karin tells him is that Garland came to see her when she first arrived and promised to call on her, only for the brush-off message to show up the next day. And that, coupled with Nettie's condition and the state of the house, made her want to come home. And while she feels guilty about lying to her father, Karin doesn't want him to know what actually happened. She doesn't want anyone to know what happened. It's pretty clear that she's lying, and Harrington doesn't believe her, and once she gets home, Rosemary dismisses her as spoiled and flaky and rude. Karin still sticks to her story, all the while agonizing over what happened to her and trying to pretend that she's okay, when she's very, very not okay. Fond of lying to my father, but I couldn't tell him about the night before. I certainly couldn't tell my mother. I had no one to tell, no one to confide in who would sympathize. I wouldn't even tell Daisy, who would be shocked and worried that if something like that could happen to me, what would happen to her? Any of my other girlfriends would luxuriate in my discomfort. I knew of how jealous of me they were and how happy they would be at learning I had been seduced. Drugged was more the way I saw it. Drinking all that limoncello was just as damaging as smoking opium. Not that I had ever done that. I had just read about it and heard stories about young girls who were sexually assaulted in those dens of sin. How was it any different for me? Had I been, if not in a den of sin that just happened to be located in a great family mansion? So, feeling that she can tell no one what happened, that she had no one to confide in, Karin tries to go back to normal, to spend time with her friends and do all the things she enjoyed before. But she can't. She is in turmoil and doesn't know how to even begin processing all that, much less cope with what happened to her. She's a hurt, scared kid, and my heart absolutely broke for her. Eventually, Rosemary and Harrington decide that Karin is going to get a summer job at the bank so that she can earn some pocket money of her own, but also to possibly land a rich husband. And if she happens to land one that could benefit Harrington in his career, all the better. Yeah, really. Like I said, Harrington has bad vibes. And Karin is not thrilled because to her this sounds like a very boring way to spend her time, but also this is their way of trying to control her and her life, which it totally is. But once she starts working, as far as first jobs go, it's not too bad. She's working as a receptionist and it's fairly chill and she's well liked by her coworkers and the customers. And once she starts making money, she can buy fun things that she likes, as money can be exchanged for goods and services. Plus, her friends are envious of her at having such adult responsibilities, which she absolutely thrives on by her own admittance. It also helps serve as a pretty decent distraction. So much so that Karin doesn't realize what's happening until she's been at her job for almost 8 weeks. At the beginning of my 8th week at the bank, it suddenly occurred to me that something was wrong. I woke at night with the realization that I had not had my monthly. It had been well over 2 weeks since my due date. Being so occupied had kept me from thinking about it. Yeah. Karin realizes pretty quickly what you probably have, that she is most likely pregnant. One day, she takes the day off from work, faking that she's sick, and bikes all the way over to Grace Rose's house, or rather the house that she's working in as a live-in nurse, to get confirmation that this is what's happening to her. And Grace Rose is the only person that Karin tells what happened to her, and what she is afraid of. And Grace Rose gives voice and confirmation to what Karin has been agonizing over these last 8 weeks. "You saying you were raped?" "I don't know if I'd put it that way," I replied. "I was offered too much of a unique alcohol drink made in Italy, and I didn't realize how much it would affect me. I drank too much of it. So someone took advantage of you while you were inebriated?" Now that this had happened, was I prepared to cast all the dark heat of blame over Garland Foxworth? "Maybe," I said. "Well, I don't think Grace Rose handles this or Karin's situation and what she's going through with the grace that she and it deserves. She does confirm Karin's worst fears, that she is most likely pregnant. And while she won't be visibly pregnant for some time, it's going to happen sooner than she thinks, and she needs to tell her parents. And if she doesn't, Grace Rose will. Which again, I feel a type of way about, but I digress. With the two of them being so close, Karin decides she's going to tell Harrington rather than Rosemary, because she's afraid that her mother will judge her or even straight up hate her for what happened. So when her father gets home and comes to check on her, as she's been in her room since she got home, Karin just blurts out that she's pregnant and that Garland is the father. She does not tell Harrington about the assault, and to be blunt about it, I don't think it would have mattered much if she did. Harrington doesn't comfort his clearly distraught and terrified teenage daughter. Instead, he forbids her from telling her mother or anyone, and to continue on as normal as he's going to handle things. The next day, when she wakes up, Harrington is gone, seemingly on a business trip, please imagine the air quotes, and Karin is terrified that he's gone to Charlottesville to throw hands with Garland. And he did go to Charlottesville, but not to throw hands. Skill issue. I would have fought Garland in the street. Harrington returns later that day. He essentially tells, keyword there, tells, Karin that he and Garland have handled everything. According to Harrington, he did confront Garland, who claims he was just too captivated by Karin's beauty because he's a scumbag, but that he's overjoyed by the news and fully intends to step up and do the right thing. He's going to marry Karin and be a father to his child. So Garland is coming for dinner, tonight, with the family to show how serious he is. Karin is still forbidden from telling Rosemary that she's pregnant, and the story I'm going to tell Rosemary is that Garland just happens to be in town on business and wants to make up for the bad impression he made at the Wexler gala. And if Karin agrees with Garland's proposal, she'll marry him and move into Foxworth Hall, where she'll stay until she gives birth. Sound familiar? Again, that poison just drips right on down. Harrington frames this as Karin having a choice in the matter. She can agree to this, or they can send her away somewhere until she gives birth, and then the baby will be sent away. But she realizes what we have realized. This isn't really a choice that she has. She doesn't have a choice. He and Garland have decided this for her. Theirs isn't a choice. This is what they've decided. She's starting to realize that in Harrington's eyes, she's really no different from her mother. House came into view. We were both going to put on an act for my mother, I thought. Whenever we had done it in the past, it was for small, even silly things, nothing compared to this. Lies and half-truths, more than anything else, were what everyone wove between them. We weren't much different after all. Now I wondered, truly wondered, Did I love Garland Foxworth enough to swim faster in the current? And if I told myself I did, would that be another lie? And if it was, I'd have to live with it for the rest of my life. So Garland comes to dinner, and he is laying it on thick. He's charming and polite and funny and complimentary. Hell, he even brings Rosemary an antique vase from France that, while she's a little startled by, is delighted to have because she's sure to be the envy of all her friends. She and Karin are a lot more alike than either of them would ever admit. And Karin, although unsure and still afraid, is so happy because her doting fairy tale prince is back. And his act is working because, don't get it twisted, this is very much an act. So much so that during dinner he just straight up proposes and insists that he wants to get married soon. Like, as soon as possible. At Foxworth Hall, of course, where the wedding, planned by Rosemary, will be the social event of the season. Rosemary is very, very caught off guard by this because, yeah, damn, that's a lot. And Karin walks Garland to the door while Harrington and Rosemary discuss the proposal. Even Karin points out that Garland is doing a bit much, but he assures her that he meant every word. I don't think he does. I don't think he ever intended to darken Karin's doorway again if she wasn't pregnant with his child. And that's what he wants. He wants that child. Foxworth Hall demands another sacrifice. I'm joking, but, not as much as you'd think. But the thing is, Karin isn't sure she even wants to marry him. This isn't the life she imagined for herself, and she's scared of losing herself, of being trapped like Rosemary in a life where she's miserable. But she's also very, very aware that she doesn't really have a choice in the matter. Not now. Is my father right? Did I still have the choice of swimming faster in the current that was sweeping me quickly into my adult life, or was I holding the hand of the man who had trapped me? Some women, my mother being one of them, believed love put a woman in a cage. She lost all her freedom because love led to marriage which was full of chains. The choices a woman had left as a wife were usually about things less significant, yet even the dinner menu, the house furnishings, and her own clothes still had the heavy hand of her husband pressing her to go this way and that. When women said they had fallen in love, I thought they really didn't realize it, but they literally meant they had fallen into something out of which they would find it nearly impossible to escape. I had taken away the one decision I believed I was owed, or perhaps, as I had always feared might happen, had suffered it being taken from me, the decision about whom to marry. I realized as we walked under the partially cloudy sky with its peekaboo stars that I would either have to be extremely happy or learn how to believe the delusions. Despite her doubts, Garland is very much a master at gaslighting and love bombing, and to be blunt about it, he's very handsome. We're told this constantly. He's very handsome, he's very rich, and he's very charming. So despite her many fears and hesitations, Karin is very much falling under his spell. And so when her parents accept the proposal, because let's be so for real, there was no way they weren't going to, despite all the things that she's worried about, Karin does say yes, and she's actually excited. Why wouldn't she be? She's going to be the mistress of the biggest, most beautiful house in the state. Her soon-to-be husband is everything she could ever want, on the surface at least. She's going to be in the upper echelons of the high society, and she's going to have more money than anyone could ever spend in a lifetime. She's going to travel and enjoy the finest things in life. What could possibly go wrong? Anyway, here's where it all goes wrong. Starts going wrong right out the gate, with Garland giving Karin his mother's engagement ring. And listen, I hear you. Stephanie, how could this possibly be a bad thing? Well, I'm so sorry that you asked. I held out my hand and Garland slipped the ring onto my finger. As I suspected, a perfect fit. My mother was remarkably similar to you in so many of her features. It's uncanny. And that seems fairly harmless. Weird, but harmless. Yeah, except it's not. Put a pin in that. And the second the Dixons accept Garland's proposal, he all but whisks them away to Foxworth Hall, and the wedding planning begins in earnest. And despite her initial reservations about Garland marriage itself, Rosemary fully locks in, because as much as she condemns Harrington and Karin for what she calls their pridefulness and their vanity, her daughter, she very much likes to be the envy of all her friends. and she's very eager to take her place in the high society that Karin's marriage basically guarantees her. So she has to look the part and actually goes out and buys a completely new wardrobe, to the shock of Harrington and Karin, as, you know, that's not something Rosemary cares about. And she basically forbids Karin from inviting Nettie and Hazel, which I think is rude. Hers being that her condition has deteriorated so much that she would embarrass the family, so she can't come to the wedding. Again, I think this is very rude, because I liked Nettie and Hazel. Upon arriving at Foxworth Hall, Harrington and Rosemary are suitably impressed, but Karin notices that the house really doesn't feel any more welcoming during the day. Garland introduces them to the staff, which, like I mentioned earlier, is kind of a skeleton crew, given how big the house is. Lucas, who is the driver but also serves as Garland's kind of personal servant, Mrs. Steiner, who is the head maid, her young niece Dora Clifford, who is another maid, as well as a couple of gardeners, and the cook. These are the people who keep Foxworth Hall running. A couple of the names probably sound familiar, as they're still working for Malcolm during Garden of Shadows, and they are very, very loyal to the Foxworths. So it's here that I want to talk about Dora. Dora is a very young, very anxious woman who walks with a slight limp because one of her legs is shorter than the other. She was born like this. And the way that she's talked about because of that is very gross and infantilizing and ableist. Dora is also very pretty, which Karin immediately takes notice of and is not thrilled by. So there's a kind of immediate animosity there. But Karin doesn't really have time to dwell on that, or anything really, because the wedding plans are in full swing as soon as they step onto the grounds, where Garland is already having a stage and a dance floor built, because to Karin's shock, they're getting married in 10 days. And when I said the wedding planning is in full swing, you probably imagine that Karin would be pretty heavily involved with it, given that, you know, it's her wedding and she's, you know, the bride. So you would think that, but that's not the case. Garland essentially hands the reins over to Rosemary, who very happily takes over. She's often talked about how she didn't get the wedding that she wanted, and the thought process from Garland and Harrington is that she'll be so distracted and so happy planning this dream wedding that if she does find out Karin is pregnant before they want her to, she'll be too happy to be mad, which is deranged, but we don't have time to unpack all that. So Garland, Harrington, and Rosemary are essentially running this show. And Karin soon realizes that despite this being her wedding, nobody is letting her do anything or choose anything. What Karin wants at her own wedding does not matter to anybody. She doesn't get to decide the food, or the music, or the guests, or even pick out her own damn wedding dress, as Garland insists that she has to wear his mother's wedding dress. And whenever Karin tries to protest, she's basically steamrolled over. None of them listen to her. None of them care what she wants. And nothing that she wants matters to them. He held my hand all the way back to the house, describing what he and my father had discussed about my wedding. I couldn't help feeling like I'd be one of the guests. Not once did he ask, "How's that sound?" or is that okay with you? And also tells Karin, keyword there, that Dora is going to be her personal maid, which means that she's essentially going to follow Karin everywhere and see that her needs are met. She's also going to be Karin's maid of honor. She literally just met this woman a few hours earlier, and hours might even be generous, because they can't invite any of her friends, not even her best friend Daisy, because that would draw attention to how young she is, and they can't have that. Karin doesn't even get to choose her own bridesmaids, much less her maid of honor. And it's also here that Garland tells Karin that she's going to be seen to by the family doctor. He's going to come visit her at Foxworth Hall. So there's no need for her to go out at all, actually. Karin is confused by all this and protests, but again, what she wants is ignored. And I think we're finally getting to see glimpses of the real Garland now that he's gotten Karin where he wants her. And beneath all his charm and his politeness and his good looks, Garland is incredibly controlling. He hides it very well, And whenever he tells Karin about these things, everything that he says is very much buried under this guise of charm and concern. Well, of course Karin would have a private doctor. She only deserves the best. And of course she'd have her own maid because she's going to be the lady of the house. But all these things are his way of controlling her. Because to be blunt about it, I don't think he really sees her as a person. He sees her as a possession, another trophy for his trophy room, another pretty decoration that will be shut up in Foxworth Hall for only him to look at. Like I said, he hides this fairly well, but we and Karin are starting to see the cracks. And we really begin to see these cracks because of Garland's mother, who we're going to talk about now. I mentioned way back in the beginning that by the time Beneath the Attic starts, both Garland's parents are dead. And Garland seems to have an interesting relationship with the Foxworth ancestors, whose many portraits grace the halls because they have portrait painting money. On the one hand, he seems to almost venerate them, but he also often mocks them for being dull and dour, and that seems to be the case for his father as well. While Garland seems to have a great deal of respect for his father, he also has very little affection for him, and honestly, I would go so far as to say he hates him, with good reason, but we'll get to that. However, that is definitely not the case for his mother, whom he is very, very devoted to. So much so that he not only wants Karin to wear her wedding dress and her engagement ring, which those things are fine on their own, he wants her to wear all his mother's clothes. He's even picked out one of her dresses for Karin to wear to dinner on their first night in Foxworth Hall, which he gives to Dora to give to her and to tell her all this. So I didn't bring this up earlier because I wanted to talk about it here, but Karin is very much into fashion. She keeps up with all the latest trends and very much prides herself on her fashion sense. It's something that's very important to her, which is something that Garland would know if he knew her at all. I don't think he'd care, but I digress. So when Karin sees Mrs. Foxworth's dress, which is very much out of fashion with her, having been dead for quite some time, and all that combined with just everything, because God knows this has been a lot, leads Karin to taking out her frustrations on Dora, something that happens quite frequently as we go forward. And she's snappish and mean to her when she rejects the dress and basically kicks Dora out of the room so she can take a nap. And when she wakes up, Garland is literally standing over her, and he's super normal about her not wanting to wear his mother's dress. For a way of getting some subtle revenge, he replied in a voice I didn't recognize, a voice that seemed to echo from a deep darkness inside of him. He resembled one of his austere, grim ancestors, frozen in a portrait hung high enough in the hallway to glare down with disapproval at anyone who dared enter Foxworth Hall. It was as though his family's ancient anger and madness had been passed down from generation to generation, wrapped in a ball of fire that was now emerging in him. Straight up accuses Karin of literally chasing Dora out of the room, something she absolutely did not do. And to be clear, I don't think Dora lied to Garland. Like I said, she's an incredibly anxious person, and Karin was shitty to her, and definitely made her cry. And then when Mrs. Steiner, who is again her aunt, found her, she went and told Garland her interpretation of things. And again, Karin protests, or tries to, when Garland insists and then tries to guilt her into wearing his mother's dress. Because again, a wedding dress is one thing, but to wear his mother's clothes is something that she is very, very much not wanting to do. And Garland does not care. What Karin wants, what she likes, what she doesn't, what's important to her, none of that matters to him. Not really. And while he lets her, gross behavior, wear her own dress to dinner, Garland insists in a way that doesn't really leave any room for argument or protest that tomorrow Karin and Dora are going to go through his mother's wardrobe and pick out things that belong to her to be tailored for Karin to wear. And when she tries to protest, Garland immediately turns on the charm. And like at the beginning of all this, he knows all the right things to say to get his way, because he always gets his way. Gentle, handsome smile returned and rushed into his cheeks and his eyes, and softened his beautiful, perfect, and manly lips. This was the face that had captured me so quickly at the Wexler gala. I felt the chill and dread recede. When Dora comes back to help Karin get ready for dinner, Karin does apologize to her and even lets Dora help her get ready, and she likes the pampering, and by her own admission, she likes having somebody to boss around. She also learns that Dora has only worked at Foxworth Hall since October, so less than a year, and that her brother works in one of Garland's factories. Although she's never worked as a professional maid, she's been a caretaker all her life, having basically helped raise her brother and cared for her parents who were older and in poor health until their deaths. And as Karin suspects, not the first of Garland's female guests that Dora has had to look after. And while Karin is a little jealous of that, she's not really surprised and consoles herself with the fact that she's the one who's going to be his wife. She's going to be the new Mrs. Foxworth. We're going to talk more about the Karin and Dora dynamic when we talk about Out of the Attic, because it's an interesting one that sadly isn't utilized as much as it should be or as well as it should be, but that's a discussion for later. While Karin doesn't end up wearing Mrs. Foxworth's dress to dinner, she does end up wearing her perfume Garland specifically left for her to wear, which I'm not qualified to unpack, so we're just going to keep moving on. And Dora has a very interesting reaction when Karin asks where the perfume came from. I mentioned that Dora is very anxious, but this isn't an anxious reaction when Karin asks. She's terrified at the mere mention of Mrs. Foxworth. Dora tells Karin that her rooms have been kept exactly as they were since she died, and they, the staff, are forbidden from touching or even moving anything. Parents' bedrooms are unchanged from how they were before they passed. The brushes still have his mother's hair in them. There is even a scarf on the floor where his mother dropped it years ago. And no one will pick it up? No, ma'am. I've said it before. Grief is weird. It's a weird thing, and it makes us do weird things. But this is something that is much more than that, in my opinion. And so Karin forms a kind of uneasy alliance with Dora. She's savvy enough to realize that Dora, like everyone else in Foxworth Hall, is loyal to Garland, and that there's something rotten and something wrong in Foxworth Hall that Garland is keeping from her. But she also realizes that she can use Dora to get the answers that Garland isn't giving her. Like I said, I like their dynamic and I think it's interesting, and I hate that more wasn't done with it. The next 10 days, Rosemary and Garland plan the wedding. They don't ask what Karin wants or her opinion on things. Oftentimes they just straight up ignore her while she's in the room with them. We also find Karin desperately trying to find some kind of connection and closeness with Garland, who can be charming and romantic when he wants to be, but also is very, very dismissive of her. While the two end up sleeping together consensually, Karin soon finds out that once they're married, Garland doesn't intend to share a room with her, much to her confusion and dismay. When she expresses this to Garland, he says that this way, when they are together, it will feel like a secret clandestine affair and thus be more romantic. This is weird. I think it's weird. Karin thinks it's weird. My partner, when I read it to them, thought it was weird, and so did the friend that I read it to. Scholars agree, this is weird. And honestly, I think it's so much worse than just simply being weird. This is another thing that really speaks to the way Garland sees Karin. She's something in his house that he can use when he pleases. That's gross and disgusting and despicable, and I hate wording it like that. But unfortunately, I think that's the case. And unfortunately, I think there's another also horrible reason for it as well. After they sleep together and Garland dumps all this on Karin, she goes to bed in her own rooms and finds his mother's nightgown laid out for her, which understandably she refuses to wear because, excuse the language, that's really fucking weird. And Dora looks terrified. Not because of Karin and her rejection, but because she's afraid of Garland, which Karin picks up on and tells her to just leave the nightgown, but to get out, which she does. And Karin is slowly coming to the realization that Garland isn't who she imagined him to be, and that once they're married, no matter how optimistic she's trying to be about the whole thing, once she says yes, she's going to be just as trapped in this house as Dora is. For time reasons, I'm going to kind of rapid fire these next bits, so just stay with me. Harrington and Rosemary are absolutely living it up at Foxworth Hall amid the wedding preparations. They're drinking and having fancy dinners. They're honestly having way more fun than their daughter, the bride, is. And they genuinely don't seem to care. Karin isn't happy. Dr. Ross, the private family doctor, visits Karin and tells her that she's basically going to be shut up in the house until she gives birth. And then they'll pass the baby off as a honeymoon baby. Dora basically becomes Karin's shadow, and while it's clear she's sympathetic to Karin and what she's going through, it becomes very obvious to us, and Karin herself, that Dora is basically there to spy on her for Garland because he's a controlling weirdo. Eventually, Rosemary and Harrington have to go back home to take care of a few things before the wedding, and so Garland and Karin are alone in Foxworth Hall at last. And he is nowhere to be found. Karin spends their first night in the house alone, and Garland doesn't return until late the next day. All the while, the wedding planning just goes on around her, and no one so much as acknowledges her. And Karin comes to the devastating realization that this is probably what the rest of her life is going to be like. And this is so heartbreaking to me for many, many reasons. Karin is very much a social, outgoing person who had tons of friends back home. Friends that she's not even allowed to invite to her wedding. And she's locked in what is essentially a gilded cage. Yes, she'll be married to a handsome, charming man who doesn't know her, who doesn't care about her, and be the mistress of a grand house that she's basically going to be hidden away in. A house where she feels unwelcome and unwanted and trapped, where her every movement is spied on and reported to her husband. And when Karin tries to tell Garland when he finally reappears that she feels lonely and isolated, he does exactly what Harrington does. He throws money at the problem and tells Karin to go shopping, which she does, but it doesn't make her any less unhappy. Made all the more worse when Karin tells Garland she bought things for their honeymoon, which he promised to take her on a very extravagant, long honeymoon. And this is when he tells her that there's not going to be a honeymoon. No discussion, just surprise, Karin, there's no honeymoon. He frames it as just being postponed because of the pregnancy, and doesn't she want what's best for their baby? Why does Karin hate babies? That's an exaggeration, but not as much as you'd think. Frustrated and annoyed, but also becoming more and more resigned to this just being her fate and her life, Karin just heads up to bed after dinner with Garland promising to come by after he finishes up a few things. So, for her own personal rooms, Karin chose the Swan Room as hers, and Dora is given Mrs. Foxworth's old room, which is nearby so that she can attend to Karin whenever she needs her. And Garland and Dora and everyone else in Foxworth Hall seem almost afraid of the Swan Room. Dora gets terrified at the very mention of it, and Garland literally will not enter the room. He stands in the doorway, but he won't come in. And Karin often talks about how unwelcome she feels in Foxworth Hall, almost like the house doesn't want her there. Yet the one room where she feels safe and feels at ease in is the Swan Room. And while true to his word, Garland does come to see Karin later that night, he's obviously very, very uncomfortable. Much so that he can't, for family-friendly reasons, we will say, perform. And he basically books it out of the room, like he runs out of the room like somebody is chasing him. Confused and genuinely worried about Garland because that is a very strange reaction, Karin gets dressed and goes after him to see if he's okay. Except he isn't in his room. And Karin actually catches him looking disheveled and rattled in the hallway. And he tells Karin that being in the Swan Room makes him so uncomfortable because it reminds him of a miscarriage his mother suffered in there that he was present for when it happened, which is horrific and traumatic. And before Karin can comfort him or even begin to process what he said, Garland quickly starts ushering her away and back to bed, even offering to spend the night with her in his room to make up for what happened in the Swan Room. And he's hurrying her away and down the hallway, but not before Karin realizes that they're not alone. It was just a flash, almost no more than a shadow, but it looked like a woman wearing one of Garland's mother's night dresses, one that I was supposed to wear. She seemed to float into another shadow. I stopped, and he turned. I thought I just saw someone, Garland. He looked back too. Where? Just for a moment wearing, I hesitated to say. Oh, probably just a Foxworth ghost, he said, smiling. Ignore them. I knew I looked shocked. Yeah, me too, girl. Like I said, Foxworth Hall is very much haunted, but it's haunted in the metaphysical sense rather than the literal. And the fact that Garland tries to gaslight Karin into thinking she saw a ghost, excuse the language, is fucking wild. And Karin isn't stupid. She knows she didn't see a ghost. She saw Dora wearing Malcolm's mother's nightgown. And so the next day, Karin confronts her, thinking what I was, what you probably were, that Garland and Dora are having an affair. But the truth is so much weirder than that. Started to cry. If I tell you, he will send me away anyway and hurt my brother. Not if I don't tell him what you've said. We need to trust each other, Dora. I have to trust you with so many personal secrets, don't I? You have to trust me with yours. Well, she looked down, took a deep breath, and looked up slowly, the tears making her eyes look more like glass. I put on his mother's clothes and lay still in her bed. Why? I don't know exactly, ma'am. He comes during the night and lies beside me. He doesn't touch me, she quickly added, but sometimes he cries, and then, before he leaves, he says, please forgive me. I don't know if he means me or maybe his mother. I don't know. If you tell him, I shook my head. I won't tell him, I said, but I felt a little numb. There were ghosts in this house. So that is absolutely horrifying, because Dora very clearly doesn't have a choice in this. She literally tells Karin that he'll hurt her brother, and I fully believe that he would. But why is Garland doing this? Why is he making Dora do this? Well, here's where we get into the speculation section of today's show, because we never really get an answer. Dora doesn't know why he does it, by her own admission. My theory is that there was abuse going on in Foxworth Hall. According to Garland in Out of the Attic, he was physically abused by his father. Like he would later do to his own son, he was beaten and locked in the attic. But I also think there was SA going on as well. And this is Garland's way of trying to cope with what happened to him. And I think it happened to him in the Swan Room. Again, this is just speculation on my part, but that's what I think happened. And like grief, trauma is weird. It makes you do weird things. But trauma is also not an excuse to treat people the way Garland is treating Dora and Karin, who is confused and horrified because all of this is confusing and horrifying. But she promises Dora that she's not going to tell Garland. But she also makes Dora promise that the next time this happens, that she'll tell her. And Dora reluctantly agrees to this. And so Karin plasters on a fake smile and goes to meet the minister who's going to marry them in order to finalize plans for a wedding that isn't really hers, that's going to happen in a house filled with secrets that she feels unwelcome and unwanted in, to a man she doesn't really know. Yet she's determined to carve out a place for herself in Foxworth Hall, to make this marriage work, to have the happy ending that she's always dreamed of. A happy ending she is now determined to fight for. I will have my place in Foxworth Hall. I will have my portrait on that wall, and with my beauty I will drown out and silence the bleak, dark chorus of ancestors that have ruled it so firmly for so long. And I so wish I could tell you that Karin does just that she's able to banish the ghosts and the darkness and the secrets from Foxworth Hall and find her place there. But we know how this story ends. And we know that it takes decades for someone to finally break the cycles of abuse and trauma that have haunted this family for literal generations. And this is where Beneath the Attic ends, with Karin now not just trapped in Foxworth Hall, but also trapped in this cycle of abuse and trauma and dysfunction, though she hasn't fully realized that yet. She is now trapped in a nightmare instead of living the fairy tale she always dreamed of. And so, this is where I leave you. As always, thanks so much for listening to all that, and until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.